Criticism doesn't hurt you. What hurts you is what you do after the criticism. Think about the last time someone critiqued your work, your idea, or worse, you. Maybe it was a harsh email from your boss. Maybe it was a malicious comment online. Or maybe it was an offhand remark from a friend. How did it feel? Your stomach tightens, your heart rate spikes, a wave of shame, anger, or self-doubt floods your mind. In that moment, the critique doesn't feel like advice. It feels like an attack. We spend our lives trying to avoid this pain. We people please. We procrastinate sharing our work. We build defensive walls so thick that nothing can get through, not even helpful feedback. But what if I told you that your instinctive reaction to criticism is dead wrong? That the pain you feel isn't inevitable, but a choice? Most people treat criticism as a threat to be neutralized, but the world's highest performers treat it as data to be mined. They have mastered a skill I call feedback alchemy. It's the ability to transform rough, negative, even malicious feedback into pure fuel for growth. In this video, we're not just going to talk about how to toughen up and take criticism. We're going deep into the psychology and neuroscience of why it hurts so much. We'll expose the lies our brains tell us when we feel attacked, and most importantly, I'm going to give you a step-by-step blueprint for building unshakable resilience. You'll learn how to separate the signal from the noise, how to decode the critic's motives, and exactly what to say when you receive terrible feedback. And pay close attention because there is one word that critics often use that can instantly hijack your brain, making it impossible to think clearly. I'll reveal what that word is later in the video. Welcome to Psych Blueprint. Let's begin the alchemy. To understand feedback alchemy, we first have to understand why we are so inherently bad at taking criticism. We are living in an old, outdated paradigm. This old paradigm says, criticism is an attack, and when attacked, you only have two options. Option 1, fight. This is the classic defensive response. Someone critiques your report, and you immediately lift 10 reasons why they're wrong. You argue back. You blame circumstances. You protect your ego at all costs. The problem with this option is that it shuts down all opportunity for learning. When you're busy defending your position, you can't see new perspectives. Option 2, flight. This is avoidance. You get a negative review and you decide never to do that thing again. You stop sharing your ideas in meetings. You people please to avoid conflict. The problem with this option is that it keeps you stuck. Growth only happens at the edge of your comfort zone, and avoidance keeps you squarely in the center of it. Both of these options are dead ends. They stem from a flawed core belief that feedback about our behavior is feedback about our identity. But there is a new paradigm, a radically different approach. Imagine your mind is a state-of-the-art alchemy laboratory. When a piece of criticism arrives, it's not a bomb thrown into the lab, it's a sample of raw ore. It's messy, it's full of impurities, dirt, and useless material. But somewhere inside that ore, there might be a speck of gold. Feedback alchemy is the process of taking that ore, running it through a rigorous series of processes, cooling it, heating it, filtering it, and extracting the gold while safely discarding the rest. The core mindset shift here is criticism is not a threat. It's just data. This brings us to an incredibly powerful ancient Buddhist concept called the second arrow. The teaching says that in life, we can't always avoid the first arrow. The first arrow is the actual painful event. In this case, it's the harsh critique, the nasty email, or the negative review. It hurts, no doubt about it. But the second arrow is what causes the real suffering. The second arrow is our reaction to the first arrow. It's the story we tell ourselves about the event. First arrow, the boss says, "This draft isn't strong enough." Second arrow. He thinks I'm incompetent. I'm going to get fired. I'm a failure. I knew it. The second arrow is optional. And that is where our power lies. When we learn to stop the second arrow, we disarm the criticism. We can look at the first arrow objectively. We can examine it without letting it destroy us. But why is this so difficult? Why does our brain insist on stabbing itself with the second arrow? To answer that, we need to dive into the evolutionary hardware of our minds. And what does this have to do with what the Navy SEALs discovered about feedback that completely changed how they operate in the most extreme environments on Earth? We'll explore that right now. Why do a few words arranged in a certain order have the power to ruin our entire day? The answer lies in how our brains are wired. At our core, humans are social creatures. Millions of years ago, rejection from the tribe meant death. If you were criticized and ostracized, you couldn't survive on your own. So, our brains evolved an incredibly sensitive threat detection system for social disapproval. Today, a negative comment on Instagram doesn't mean you're going to be eaten by a tiger, but your brain reacts as if it might. This threat detection system is driven by an almond-shaped structure deep in your brain called the amygdala. The amygdala acts as your smoke alarm. When it perceives a threat, whether physical or social, it triggers the fight or flight response. When you receive criticism, your amygdala screams. It releases stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, and crucially, it shuts down the functioning of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for logical thinking, planning, and impulse control. This phenomenon is known as the amygdala hijack. Essentially, when you feel attacked by criticism, the smartest part of your brain goes offline. That's why you can't think of a coherent response in the moment. That's why you say things you later regret. You are operating from your survival brain, not your thinking brain. To add insult to injury, we also contend with something called negativity bias. Our brains are wired to pay more attention to negative information than positive information. One criticism carries far more emotional weight than 10 compliments. As psychologist Roy Baumeister put it, bad is stronger than good. So, we have an overly sensitive smoke alarm and a tendency to focus on the bad. It's no wonder handling criticism is so hard.
So what happens in our minds when we haven't mastered feedback alchemy? We fall into a defensive reaction loop. It usually goes something like this. Stage 1. Impact. The criticism lands. The amygdala hijack occurs. Emotions flare. Stage 2. Interpretation. This is the critical moment where the second arrow is fired. We don't look at the feedback objectively. Instead, we filter it through our insecurities and core beliefs. We engage in what psychologists call cognitive distortions. The two most common distortions when facing criticism are personalization. We turn a critique of a specific action into an attack on our entire being. This report has errors becomes, "I am an idiot." Catastrophizing. We exaggerate the consequences of the feedback. The boss didn't like this idea becomes, "My career is over." Stage 3. Reaction. Based on this distorted interpretation, we lash out. We fight or flee. We attack the person giving the feedback, or we retreat into our shell. Stage 4. Aftermath. Relationships are damaged, growth is stunted, and most importantly, we reinforce the belief that criticism is dangerous. The loop continues. The core confusion here is between doing and being. The old paradigm confuses what we do with who we are. Feedback alchemy breaks this confusion. It allows us to look at our actions without judging our self-worth.
Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds great in theory, but what about unfair criticism? What about internet trolls? Am I supposed to take their feedback seriously? This is a crucial point. Not all criticism is created equal. This is where the filtration skills in your alchemy lab become vital. We can categorize feedback into three main types. Type 1. Constructive feedback. This is pure gold. It's specific, behavior-focused, and delivered with the intention of helping you grow. It usually comes from mentors, trusted colleagues, or genuine customers. Type 2. Vague feedback. This is low-quality ore. It's non-specific or unactionable. Examples: I just don't like this, or it needs more pizzazz. It's not malicious, but it's not very helpful either. You need to dig deeper to find the value. Type 3. Destructive criticism or ad hominem attacks. This is not ore. This is toxic waste. It's focused on your personhood, not your behavior. It's delivered with the intent to harm, manipulate, or assert dominance. It often comes from trolls, envious people, or those projecting their own insecurities onto you. Feedback alchemy doesn't mean you have to accept everything everyone says about you. It means you have to be smart enough to know when to engage and when to discard. When faced with toxic waste, your job is not to process it. Your job is to dispose of it safely without letting it contaminate your lab. Sometimes the most powerful way to handle destructive criticism is not to react at all. Another skepticism: isn't a little defensiveness healthy? Doesn't it show I care about my work? There is a difference between explaining and defending. Explaining is calmly and objectively providing context or clarifying a misunderstanding. Defending is protecting your ego from a perceived threat. The former is helpful. The latter is harmful. Now, remember that word I mentioned at the beginning, the one that can instantly hijack your brain? That word is you, especially when used in an accusatory context. Compare. This report has several inaccuracies versus you made mistakes in this report. The first focuses on the behavior. The second focuses on the identity. When we hear the word you in that way, our amygdala activates instantly. Being aware of the power of this word can help you recognize when your emotional response is being triggered.
The consequences of not mastering this skill are massive. It doesn't just affect your career growth. It affects your relationships, your mental health, and your overall quality of life. If you can't take feedback, you can't grow. You remain stuck at your current level of competence. In the professional world, this means being passed over for promotions, being seen as difficult to work with, or worse, becoming obsolete. In personal relationships, defensiveness is one of the biggest predictors of divorce. If you can't listen to your partner's feedback without attacking back or shutting down, the relationship will eventually erode. Conversely, mastering feedback alchemy is a superpower. Consider the case of Alex, the chef we mentioned earlier. Alex had worked for months on an innovative new dish, a bold fusion of classic French technique and Southeast Asian flavors. He was proud of it. Then a famous food critic came in. The review was published with the headline, "Fusion Confusion, Alex's Misguided Attempt." The critic slammed the dish as overcomplicated, unfocused, and insulting to tradition. Alex's instinct was rage. He wanted to call the critic and scream. He wanted to post a long rebuttal on social media. He felt personally attacked. This is the old paradigm. But Alex had been training in feedback alchemy. Instead of reacting immediately, he took the first step, cooling the ore. He went for a walk. He breathed. He waited 24 hours until the amygdala hijack subsided. Then he brought the review into the lab. He began the filtration process. He separated the data from the drama. He crossed out the inflammatory language like confusion and insulting. Then he searched for the gold. He noticed the critic had misunderstood the use of a specific herb, assuming it was traditional when it was actually a modern twist. That was a data point. He needed to clarify his intention better on the menu. But then he found a comment about the texture. The sauce is too heavy, overwhelming the delicacy of the fish. This was gold. Alex realized that in his effort to make the flavor bold, he had ruined the balance of the dish. He went back to the kitchen, he adjusted the sauce, he clarified the menu description. A month later, that dish became his signature item. That is the power of feedback alchemy. It's not just about surviving criticism, it's about using it to get better. This brings us to the Navy SEALs. In their line of work, feedback isn't just about personal growth, it's about life and death. They conduct brutal after-action reviews, or AARs, after every mission. What they discovered is that ego is the enemy of high performance. In the AAR, rank means nothing. Everyone must be willing to give and receive harsh feedback without defensiveness. They practice what they call extreme ownership. If something went wrong in your area of operation, you own it, even if it wasn't entirely your fault. They have created a culture where feedback is seen as a gift, not an attack, and that is what allows them to continuously improve and adapt in unimaginable situations. Now that we understand the psychology and the impact, it's time to open the toolkit and start building your own alchemy lab.
Mastering feedback alchemy doesn't happen overnight. It's a deliberate process that requires practice. Here is the 3-phase blueprint for turning feedback into fuel. The first step when receiving difficult feedback is to stop the second arrow and regulate your emotional response. You can't do alchemy when the lab is on fire. Tool 1, the 24-hour rule. This is your circuit breaker. When you receive feedback that triggers your emotional response, commit to not reacting, not responding, and not making any major decisions for 24 hours. This allows the cortisol to dissipate from your bloodstream. It allows your prefrontal cortex to come back online. It creates space between the event and your reaction. If the feedback is delivered in person, you can't wait 24 hours to respond. In that case, use tool 2, the tool of buying time. Instead of reacting defensively, use a neutral phrase to acknowledge the feedback and buy yourself time to process it. Examples: thank you for sharing that. I need a moment to think about it, and I will get back to you. Or simply, that's an interesting perspective. Let me absorb that. This shows you have listened, but doesn't commit you to agreement. Tool 3, the physiological sigh. This is the fastest way to calm your nervous system in real time. It was discovered by researchers at Stanford. How to do it? Take 2 quick inhales through your nose, followed by a long, slow exhale through your mouth. Repeat 2 or 3 times. This immediately lowers your heart rate and calms your amygdala.
Once you are calm and objective, it's time to bring the ore into the lab and begin the filtration process. The goal is to determine whether you are dealing with constructive, vague, or destructive feedback. We use the CARE filtration framework. C. Context. Where and when was this feedback delivered? Was it delivered publicly to shame you, or privately to help you? The context often reveals the intent. Agenda. What is the motive of the person giving the feedback? Do they genuinely care about your growth? Or are they trying to assert dominance, vent their frustration, or manipulate you. Ask yourself, is this person qualified to give this feedback? Do they have expertise in this area? R. Relevance. Is this feedback relevant to your goals and values? If a random stranger critiques your lifestyle, but that lifestyle aligns with your values, the feedback might be irrelevant. Don't take criticism from people you wouldn't go to for advice. E. Evidence. Is the feedback based on objective evidence or just subjective opinion? Did they provide specific examples of your behavior? Or are they using generalizing and accusatory language? If the feedback fails the CARE criteria, especially on agenda and relevance, it's likely toxic waste. Dispose of it safely and move on. If it's vague feedback, your job is to clarify it. Ask follow-up questions. When you say, "It needs more pizzazz," can you give me a specific example of what you have in mind? If it's constructive feedback, move to phase 3.
This is where the real growth happens. Your goal is to find the truth in the feedback, even if it's delivered clumsily. Tool 1, the 1% truth rule. Most criticism, even the harshest kind, contains at least a grain of truth. Your job is to find that 1%. Look at the feedback and ask yourself, if I were forced to find something valuable in this, what would it be? This shifts your brain from defense mode to problem-solving mode. Tool 2, separating intent from impact. Sometimes people give feedback with good intentions, but their delivery has a negative impact. Conversely, sometimes they have bad intentions, but their feedback is still valid. Don't let the delivery distract you from the content. Focus on the information you can use. Tool 3, the powerful response script. How you close the feedback loop is crucial. It sets the tone for future interactions. Here is a 3-step script for responding to constructive feedback. Step 1, thank the person genuinely. Thank you for taking the time to share this with me. I appreciate it. Step 2, acknowledge the points you agree with. You are absolutely right that the presentation could have been more concise. I got too lost in the details. Step 3, state what you will do differently. Next time, I will focus on the 3 key takeaways and keep the background information in the appendix. This demonstrates humility, self-awareness, and a commitment to growth. Now remember the scenario we mentioned earlier. What to do when someone gives you terrible feedback in public. This is a high-pressure situation. Your goal is not to win the argument. Your goal is to maintain professionalism and move the conversation to a private setting. Never engage in a public debate. You will always lose. Instead, say, "Thank you for your feedback. I'd like to understand your perspective better. Can we discuss this in more detail after the meeting?" This de-escalates the situation, shows respect, even if they don't deserve it, and allows you to address the issue privately, where you can use the CARE framework. By practicing these steps, you are gradually rewiring your nervous system. You are teaching your amygdala that criticism is not an existential threat. You are becoming a master feedback alchemist.
In the end, we must accept a difficult but liberating truth. You are going to be criticized. If you are doing anything interesting, anything creative, anything outside the box, you will attract attention, and some of that attention will be negative. As Aristotle said, there is only one way to avoid criticism: do nothing, say nothing, and be nothing. The goal is not to avoid feedback. The goal is to change your relationship with it. We began this journey by acknowledging the pain of criticism, the feeling of being attacked, the amygdala hijack, the second arrow of self-judgment. This is the human default state. But now you have seen that there is another way. You have seen the model of feedback alchemy. You are no longer a passive victim of other people's opinions. You are the chief scientist in the laboratory of your own mind. You have the tools to stabilize your emotions, filter information objectively, and extract value from even the most difficult feedback. You have the 24-hour rule for creating space. You have the CARE framework for evaluating the source and the content. You have the 1% truth rule for finding growth. Imagine how confident you will feel when you are no longer afraid of judgment. Imagine how fast you will grow when you can harness the power of every piece of feedback you receive. That is true empowered resilience. It doesn't come from believing you are perfect. It comes from knowing that you have the skills to learn from your imperfections. Now, I have a challenge for you. Don't just watch this video and move on with your life. Take the first step. The next time you receive feedback, big or small, practice the 24-hour rule. Notice your emotional reaction. Give yourself space to process it before reacting. This simple act alone will start to change everything. If you found this video valuable, hit the like button and subscribe to Psych Blueprint. We are here to give you evidence-based blueprints for mastering your mind and your life. And I'm curious, which tool from this video resonated the most with you? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Now go out there and start turning lead into gold.